Hi, welcome everyone to our talk brought to you by MJC's Modesto Junior College's Civic Engagement Project. The talk is titled The Constitutionality of Compulsory Vaccinations, Government Power versus Individual Liberty by Dr. Stephen Routh of CSU, California State University, Stanislaus. My name is Bill Anelli. I'll be the host of this event. I teach philosophy here at Modesto Junior College, and I'm co-chair along with Ruth Lumen of the CEP. And I want to thank the Civic Engagement Project staff and faculty who have worked hard to bring this event to you. I also wish to thank members of our Board of Trustees who are with us tonight, as well as Chancellor Yang and MJC President Dr. B. The talk tonight is extremely timely, as our Board of Trustees will, on October 20th, be making a final decision on whether COVID immunizations will be required at MJC and Columbia College in the spring of 2022. This morning, Governor Newsom announced that all K through 12 must require COVID immunization, along with CSUs and the UCs. Roughly 1/2 of community colleges are now requiring COVID immunizations at last count a week ago. At recent town hall meetings at MJC, key issues discussed have been the rights of American citizens to choose whether to be vaccinated or not, which laws or regulations MJC is subject to, who counts as a legitimate expert on vaccine science, religious exemptions, and the financial impact of requiring versus not requiring vaccines, for example, class spacing. In this informative talk that will address many of these issues, Dr. Routh will put in historical context the US Constitution, Supreme Court rulings regarding the power of federal, state, and local public health departments to require immunizations. This talk will last about 45 minutes. It will be followed by Q&A, at which point Dr. Routh can elaborate on questions that you have about his talk or related questions about his talk. In the chat, I'm now posting a Google link to a PDF of Dr. Routh's outline, so you should see it there. You might want to click on that now, and you can follow along with his talk. Next Wednesday, I want to make an announcement. Next Wednesday at Modesto Junior College on October 6th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on our East Campus, free vaccines will be made available to the public. And I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. So you should see that as well. And I'll do that again. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to review a couple logistics with you. First, this talk will be recorded. The recording will be available at the CEP website and our YouTube channel. The CEP website also has links to recent science talks about MJC science talks on the vaccine and COVID. Those science talks are based on science expert communities with a specialization in vaccinology and or immunology, and specifically those who are actively publishing and reviewing the latest peer-reviewed data in those fields. Now I'll put those links in the chat for you as well. The talk will be accompanied by a live transcript. It's kind of like subtitles in a film, so you can click on the bottom right of your screen to see the transcript in real time. Once the talk concludes, we'll switch over to Q&A. There is a Q&A button at the bottom center of your screen, maybe a little to the left of center. Simply type your question and the CEP co-hosts will see your question, and then we'll pose that to Dr. Routh. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions. Now you can also type in Q&A during the talk as well. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Professor Stephen Routh is in his 20th year at CSU Stanislaus, where he is professor of political science and an associate dean at the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. His PhD is from UC Davis, and that was in American politics and government with a particular focus on national institutions and public law. He has scholarly publications on the courts, the presidency, and the Congress. Floor is yours, and thank you so much, Dr. Routh, for doing this talk for us tonight.
Well, Bill, thank you very, very much for having me. This is always a thrill, a treat to visit MJC. I've done this several times in the past, and it's always been enjoyable. A little odd via Zoom. I miss the crowds, as we all do, but we will make do here. First, I have got to make a quick happy birthday to MJC. It's your 100th year, a century. CSU Stanislaus is only in diapers, only like 60 years old. So that's a phenomenal century of really advancing the interest in education of people in the Central Valley. So well done to MJC. And I've taught many an excellent student of yours who came to Stanislaus State. So thank you for all your efforts there, for sure. So to the topic directly, is a great topic to address right now. Obviously, it's highly prominent, and it's a great con law question. And it's highly salient because there's a ton of fear and anxiety out there. Fear and anxiety about the virus, about the disease, the illness it causes, as well as a ton of fear and anxiety about governmental overreach. And so my talk tonight is in 45 minutes is to hopefully clarify concisely what the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted the U.S. Constitution as allowing or not allowing, what the U.S. Constitution requires or does not require in terms of governmental entities being able to regulate and require vaccines to people. So without further ado, let me jump into my kind of remarks here directly, and we'll move through this hopefully efficient manner. There's a lot to discuss. Obviously, I'm a professor, so I can just pontificate endlessly. I'm trying to be as focused and really on track as possible to make sure we have ample time for Q&A. I think I'm looking forward to the Q&A to really get engagement and questions and back and forth with the audience here. And so looking at the numbers, there's 75 participants. That's great to see. So that's appreciated. Okay, so open your remarks here. Now focus on the foremost characteristic of American government is this idea of federalism. We have a federalist system, and so it's unique. It's a really unique system. We started it. Several other countries have copied it. But the heart of it is that you've got this reality is you have both the national government, the federal government, headquarters in Washington, D.C., operating at the same time, having jurisdiction over the American people, just as the state governments do at the same time. So you have two levels of government. You have the national government and basically the states operating at the same time. So there's an inherent tension over the years between what can the states do, what can the feds do. The Civil War was very, very much a federalist question about what can the national government, impose upon the states and so forth. So I make mention of that here in terms of vaccine requirements, is that basically there's the reality is that both levels of government share responsibility, share authority over public health matters in this country. So it's a very, very, very important point element to keep in mind here. And that's brought to you directly by the US Constitution as a system it essentially constructed and currently structures. So one thing also I want to make quick mention here, very important, is to recognize the historical contentiousness of mandated vaccines in this country. This is a contentious country, rough and tumble democracy. It's always back and forth. And ever since vaccinations were first put in use and ultimately required in the 1800s with smallpox, and basically in the 1900s, the 20th century, you had phenomenal advances in vaccinations, with polio, diphtheria, rubella, measles, et cetera. There's always contentions. There's always people opposed to it. The people who don't trust the government, who don't trust the science, who don't believe the science. They don't think the data is accurate or correct. And so I just want to briefly clarify the terminology here because it's very telling, generally speaking, when you talk about anti-vaccinations, what term you utilize to refer to them, because it indicates generally kind of your attitude about them. If you call them anti-vaxxers, which is a common term now for that, for this group of people, that has a negative connotation to it. So generally speaking, if you're an anti-vaccinationist, you generally prefer to be called a vaccine safety advocate instead. The more politically neutral term is like vaccine skeptic, which I personally prefer. Also called vaccine hesitant, vaccine resistant. So, but I mean, so it's very telling. And when someone utilizes a particular term, what their attitude is towards people who are opponents to required vaccines. I've listed there in the outline potential sources of the mindset of why do people oppose required vaccines, and a number of those positions are rationally based. A number of them are based more on emotions instead. We'll definitely discuss that at the Q&A. I don't want to get bogged down in that now. I want to keep moving forward with actual con law stuff, but I definitely want to get audience participation, audience input, and questions about what do you think drives what drives majority, what drives some, at least some level of opposition to these mandates. So let's go to state and local authority over vaccinations. Start off here, very important thing to recognize here are that the states possess general police power. States possess general police power, and that directly stems from the reserved powers as laid out in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Let me unwrap that a bit for you. So basically, police power is coming from the reserved powers. Reserved powers or considered to come from the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment basically says this, I'm paraphrasing it for clarity's sake. 10th Amendment basically says that the powers of the U.S. Constitution that, I'm going to say it like this, that the upshot here is that the powers not given to the federal government, power is not given to the federal government in the Constitution, and the powers that are prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. So again, the power is not given to the federal government in the Constitution, as well as in the Constitution, the powers prohibited to the states are reserved left to the states. So this is an incredibly open-ended grant of power states have. And so at the heart of that, since day one of this country, it's been assumed and concluded and followed that basically states have this police power. And the police power is essentially this, is the legitimate authority. It's the legitimate authority of state governments and localities, municipalities, and counties under states. They have the inherent police power. They have the authority to put forth regulations to ensure public health, public safety, public welfare, and public morals. So obviously, first one in that list is a critical one for our discussion tonight, public health. That's always been there. It's always been in that. And so again, this general police power given to states stems from the 10th Amendment, the reserved powers. It's one thing to keep in mind here, particularly in terms of constitutional law and understanding the Constitution. And I'm going to say this very, very quickly, but it's important you be aware of this. There are two schools of thought with the U.S. Constitution. Is it a positive Constitution or is it a negative Constitution? If it's a negative Constitution, you see it as basically its main purpose is to constrain power of the government, to make sure government is not abusive, it's not tyrannical, it's not engaging in problematic overreach, intruding upon people's rights, et cetera, et cetera. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is instead a positive Constitution? Is it instead empowering government to be able to take care of problems that individuals by themselves cannot rectify, cannot fix? So again, think about when you think about required vaccinations, and you think about the Constitution in general, and you think about and think about the role the state government and the U.S. Congress play, et cetera. Think about your default assumptions. How do you see the Constitution? Do you see it as a positive document, empowering, enabling the federal government to be able to fix things, state governments as well? Or is it much more inherently a constraint, a restraint on basically potential abuse? Obviously, the reality is somewhere in the middle, but as you think about your own default assumptions about it, it clarifies, generally speaking, probably your take on whether or not you think government has the legitimate constitutional authority to mandate, require vaccinations on the general public as well as children going to school. So one thing to keep in mind here, particularly precisely because of the police powers given to the states, that the vast majority, the vast bulk of required vaccination laws and rules and policies are done at the state level. Federal government does a little bit, and we'll clarify that in basically a second, but the vast majority of required vaccines and public health rules come from the states, but the feds have a voice, obviously, and we'll definitely discuss that in a bit. Okay, one thing to compare here, particularly with the state police powers, is the recognition that there are inherent limits on the federal government. So again, states are given this open-ended police powers authority. That's very different from the federal government. The Constitution is very clear, and as the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted in many a case, is this idea that the federal government can only act its authority is only being predicated based just upon one of the 17 enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 2. So Article 1, Section 8, I'm sorry. And so Article 1, Section 8 lays out 17 specifically enumerated powers. Federal government can only engage in constitutional authority if it can draw a direct connection between that law that they're advancing, that policy, and one of those enumerated powers. So we'll definitely come back to that in like a couple of minutes. So let's now turn to the big case here, the biggest case here of all time. The foundational precedent here is Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905. That is the go-to precedent here that the court laid out that basically guides and directs judicial reviews of these required vaccines from the 1800s on up to now. So the Jacobson ruling is the cornerstone. Jacobson ruling is the cornerstone of jurisprudence in this area. Now, importantly here, again, this is decided 116 years ago, 1905. That's a long time ago. So the U.S. Supreme Court in Jacobson, it upheld the right of states to compel, to coerce vaccinations. So state of Massachusetts, background facts here briefly, state of Massachusetts had a law that required people over the age of 21 had to get the smallpox vaccine, because smallpox was a major scourge back there, killed a lot of people. The kind of mortality rate of smallpox back then was like, 30%, almost a third of everyone who got the disease died from it. That's a serious problem, obviously. So the court concluded in Jacobson that that Massachusetts state law here requiring vaccinations for people over the age of 21, that was a reasonable exercise, a reasonable constitutional exercise of the state's police power that did not violate the liberty rights of individuals and the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Let me give you a quick little background on that. Due process clause of the 14th Amendment states as follows. It declares as follows, that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So the key element there, the key term there is liberty, and that this has been a major focal point in many a case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, clarifying what exactly does that liberty entail, and figuring out what that liberty entails necessarily clarifies what limitations can government go to impose its will on individual rights. And so the notion here then is the court looked at the 14th Amendment, looked at the liberty interest inside the 14th Amendment, the due process clause, and it decided that yes, this was an intrusion, no doubt about it. Forcing people to get a vaccine, that's definitely an intrusion upon someone's freedom, absolutely. However, it did fall legitimately from the constitutional authority of the police power to maintain public health. So the important thing that the court laid out here, and this is again 1905. This is the precedent. This is the rationale. This is the principle that other courts have had to follow ever since, and we follow now. Is the following rule: is that basically the court in Jacobson determined that the Massachusetts vaccination program had, quote, a real and substantial relation to the protection of the public health and safety, unquote, real and substantial relation to the protection of the public health and safety, unquote. And hence then that governmental objective, that governmental interest overrode the liberty interest of individuals. So Mr. Jacobson, obviously in his legal briefs and his lawyer laying out the oral argument to the court 116 years ago, he stated the following in his arguments, quote, again, you see, again, that's one thing I mentioned earlier in this talk about how the type of rhetoric you see then is the exact same type of rhetoric you see now. So the logic is there. I mean, so it's remarkable to see, because we all kind of wring our hands in national TV. Oh my God, American democracy! We're so coarse in our discussions, and there's really been a deterioration in discourse and dialogue. This country's always been like that, and you see, and again, you see the same scripts back then, you see them now. So Jacobson stated the following directly in his arguments before the court. As Jacobson said, quote, a compulsory vaccination is unreasonable, arbitrary, and oppressive, and therefore hostile to the inherent right of every freeman to care for his own body and health in such ways as to him seems best, and that the execution of such a law against one who objects to vaccination, no matter for what reason, is nothing short of an assault upon his person. So you definitely see here that kind of very, very contemporary notion articulated, saying that that individuals in this country, this is America, damn it, we should maintain bodily integrity. The government has no business, shooting substances into our body if we don't want them shot into. So one thing, that the court said in its majority opinion, ruling against Jacobson, the court said this idea that the court made a point of specifically rejecting the idea of an exemption based upon personal choice. It said basically, and the court said, if the court allowed that type of exemption from required vaccines, the court said directly, quote, we would in reality, would practically strip the legislative department of its function to care for the public health and the public safety when endangered by epidemics of disease, unquote. So the court acknowledges in Jacobson that, okay, we again appreciate there's intrusion upon some level of freedom here, indeed, but the mission of government is to protect the public and protect the common welfare. And if you allowed willy-nilly exemption after exemption for personal based on personal choice, the government would not be able to maintain public health at all. The court elaborated further here, and it said, quote, the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States to every person within its jurisdiction does not import an absolute right in each person to be at all times and in all circumstances wholly free from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. On any other basis, organized society could not exist with safety to its members, unquote. So this is why this is the go-to case 116 years ago. And I keep mentioning how long ago it is, because a lot of things have happened since then. I will discuss in basically a minute. But this is intriguing that you see contemporary lawyers and litigators here. You definitely can see, like in Texas and Florida, where you have the governors, kind of trying to rein in masking, rein in the vaccination requirements. They're pushing back against what they see as problematic overreach by public health officials, and that because they see that mostly almost all Republicans are pushing back against what they see as this overly paternalistic nanny state, and this is America, and we should be free to make these choices. Now, the interesting thing, I mentioned this because there's a new line of thought. I think you're going to see more and more in litigation with courts around masking and vaccinations or from distancing stuff. Is this notion is that because the classic con law dispute, classic con law lawsuit always stems from the government has gone too far, and individual sues trying to stop the government from going too far. That basically it's been an imposition, it's been a violation of someone's liberty as laid out inside the 14th Amendment. A new argument coming out, new interpretations of Jacobson is putting forth this idea is that maybe the liberty interest not just involves just holding back government, but also the liberty interest can actually require government to take action to prevent other people from being infected with an otherwise lethal disease. So there's a new take, a new perspective on this now, that this idea, we're going to see this more and more in the courts for sure, I'm sure, is this idea that the liberty interest is not just about holding back government, it's also about empowering government to take actions to rein in other people's decisions that they see as a personal choice, but is ultimately transmitting a potentially lethal disease. So that liberty necessarily involves the government taking action to protect individuals as well as preventing government from overly intruding into other people's rights. So this is going to be very, very intriguing to watch the next several months and years inside the courts. Indeed, one thing as well here, very important aspect of Jacobson. The critical aspect here, absolutely, is this idea of a reasonability standard, that basically for public health measures, for the courts not to overrule and strike down as an abuse of power, as unconstitutional actions taken by the government, taken by the states, is that those public health measures have to be reasonable. They have to be, they can't be arbitrary. They can't be capricious. They have to be grounded in fact and reason here. Now, the big question, obviously, that hopefully jumps out at you, and it's the big question in the courts indeed, is like, what's arbitrary or unreasonable in this regard? The courts make a point, when trying to figure out, okay, is the government acting unreasonably, arbitrarily, capriciously? The general orientation of the courts, the U.S. Supreme Court and lower courts in the states and the federal courts as well, is the general orientation is deference. The courts, those judges are going to defer to executive branch and legislative branch expertise and knowledge and judgment on public health matters, and that relevant scientific data in this regard. So I'll repeat that. It's very important to recognize this and understand this is at the heart of a lot of the current debates now about COVID and masking, what have you. So again, the courts generally defer to executive branch and legislative branch expertise and knowledge and judgment on public health matters and the relevant scientific data in this regard. So Jacobson's a big deal, and so laid out for you briefly, but I think concisely exactly its impact here, and the logic and the reasoning the courts have to hop through to figure out whether or not a public health measure like a required vaccine is constitutional or not. The other landmark decision here was decided in 1922 in the case of Routh versus King from San Antonio, Texas. And this case dealt with required vaccinations for children going to school. And so the court directly drew upon the Jacobson principle and basically ruled it's constitutional, completely constitutional for states to require vaccination of kids going to public and private schools, because the recognition they're super spreaders, their transmissibility, they're trapped in a classroom all day with other kids. It's basically transmission problems, infections galore. So as the court stated here in Routh, as it directly drew upon the Jacobson logic indeed, the court said here in Routh, quote, "It is within the police power of a state to provide for compulsory vaccination, and that these ordinances, the state laws, did not confer arbitrary power, but only that broad discretion required for the protection of the public health." So again, what the upshot here is you've clearly seen here that the courts are showing great deference. They're not comfortable second guessing the public health expertise or the legislative preferences, either the executive branch or like the state legislature. They're not comfortable doing that precisely because judges recognize they don't have the background, they don't have the resources, they can't spend all their time second guessing what basically the government is doing in this regard, because obviously public health issues can be a major crisis, a pandemic, an epidemic. They have to move quickly, and so judges they recognize they're not equipped to make those types of decisions, and so they defer to the political elected branches. And so the upshot here, the typical orientation coming from Jacobson and Routh, et cetera, is this notion that basically, if the people don't like, ultimately the people don't like what their government, what the governor is doing or what the state legislature is doing, that's what elections are for. You vote them out of office. And so again, you think about the recall with Newsom just a couple of weeks ago. That was a major referendum on to some extent his handling of COVID and a number of other things, but clearly people California said keep him. We were okay with what he's doing. I think that's the general default orientation of courts in this type of issue area. Deference to the legislature, deference to the executive branch, and the public health officials who have that expert knowledge. It also gets at the idea then with further authority to coerce vaccination of children comes under the doctrine of a Latin term. You're in heavily in con law when you hear the Latin coming out, parens patri. And the essence of parens patri, that doctrine, is basically this idea that the government or any other authority, is regarded, but for our purposes here, the government, it's regarded as a legal protector of citizens unable to protect themselves. The legal protector of citizens able to protect themselves. This is a long-term common law principle and idea. And so you definitely see this utilized in the 1944 case of Prince versus Massachusetts again. And this involved, this case involved child labor under the parents' asserted right of their First Amendment religious freedom rights. And so the court, very importantly, in this case, it's not addressing required vaccines for kids, but it's definitely articulating very well, very effectively, this parens patriae doctrine that is clearly at the heart and soul of government, state governments being able to require kids to get vaccines against deadly or problematic diseases. And so as the court said here in Prince, quote, neither rights, and this is a very important, this is a really a compelling statement showing how aggressive the court understood this critical relationship between government power on one hand, individual rights on the other, and protecting child welfare. So the court said this, quote, in Prince, neither rights of religion nor rights of parenthood are beyond limitation, acting to guard the general interest in youth's well-being. The state as parens patriae may restrict the parents' control by requiring school attendance, regulating or prohibiting the child's labor, and many other ways. Its authority is not nullified merely because the parent grounds his claim to control the child's course of conduct on religion or conscience. Thus, he cannot claim freedom from compulsory vaccination for the child more than for himself on religious grounds. The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to communicable disease or the latter to ill health or death. So distilling that down to its essence here, the court makes clear here in Prince, 1944, that both parental rights and religious beliefs, they must bend their knee to the public interest. So one thing to take note here, to wrap up the state authority stuff here, is that this is America. You get a lawyer and you sue, and so you've had lawsuits since like the 1890s. You've had lawsuits before that, but they really as more and more as these vaccines came more and more capable of being produced and basically invented, created, and basically required, then you definitely have seen lawsuits in state courts and federal courts indeed. And so but again, the consistent trend, as I said before, and I'll say it again for emphasis, judges defer, they generally rule in favor of these required vaccines. That's been the historical record, state judges and federal judges. And they uphold these mandates because, again, judges keep deferring to the assessments, the knowledge, and the preferences of the elected branches. So the first challenge in this state to such a requirement was 1890, and as I said, so the typical result for state courts is to rule in favor of their state's authority to compel vaccinations when reasonability warrants. And that, again, that remains the key standard then and the key standard now. Is it reasonable? Is it reasonable for what the government is doing in response to this particular virus, illness, disease, bacteria, what have you? So one of the things I definitely want to make quick mention of for you to be mindful of is this recognition. This idea that, well, let me see. Yeah, this idea that when you do see judges rule against, what a state government's doing with a compelled vaccine or some other related public health measure, is typically a focus on, they don't want the executive branch to make that call. They want the legislature to mandate the vaccination because they want the people's branch directly to make the call on whether or not a vaccination is required. So again, that's one thing when you see, the only really pushback you see when states lose in these court proceedings is when, and we'll definitely see this with President Biden and the feds, we'll discuss that in a minute for sure. But this notion here then is that, is this idea that when you're going to put forth, a serious law that's going to impact people's lives and their kids' lives, by forcing them to get immunized, the legislature should be the one really making that call. It should not be left up to executive branch officials. I mean, the governor's elected, of course, but the idea then the state judges really prefer to see the legislature making that call, not delegating that authority too much over to the executive branch to make that determination. All right, we'll skip Charles. The Professor Charles treatise there for right now. We'll come back to that later. But let me kind of briefly lay out for you, so I'm on time here. This one thing to keep in mind here briefly, and it's very important to be mindful of this, that Jacobson was decided in 1905. That's a long time ago. And in the 20th century, there was a phenomenal evolution, a phenomenal growth in US Supreme Court. Both liberal Supreme Courts and conservative Supreme Courts were very much animated, energized to protect individual rights. So 1905, 1922, they were very, very conservative Supreme Courts. But they really saw the common good overrode the individual freedom stuff for sure. In the 20th century, you had a much greater appreciation and much more remarkable, clear development in jurisprudence coming from the court that worked to make sure freedom of speech was protected, freedom of religion was protected, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, reproduction rights, child rearing rights. So again, one of the things to watch here with the U.S. Supreme Court coming up as these cases percolate up to the Roberts Court now is how you have this very different orientation towards individual rights. Because again, people invoke, as I've laid out here, Jacobson is the precedent, but Jacobson is a precedent from a long time ago, and so you very well may see some change here. You very well may not. I mean, what the court lays out in Jacobson and in Routh and in Prince, it makes a lot of sense. But you have a different a different flavor of public opinion now, and a very different sense about a court, particularly this more conservative court, much more sensitive, much more appreciative, much more protective of people's religious rights. And so we're going to see how that plays out in due course. Okay, so moving on here. Okay, so federal authority over vaccination. Well, no, my last comment there, I know it's my outline there. Definitely, I want to, and we'll definitely discuss this in the Q&A, but it does raise this really critical question about, as I mentioned earlier, about what role should elite scientific opinion play in determining public policy? Because a lot of people, there are a lot of distrust. There's some level of distrust over the scientific data, over CDC, the FDA. Do they have it right? Are these vaccines safe? Is it a big scam by the pharmaceutical people just trying to make money? So the question arises then, and it's a big question about how does one reconcile this is a democracy, public opinion is incredibly important to determine policy. I mean, that's what democracies are about. But then how do you balance that out? How do you reconcile that with the inherently privileged opinion, not just opinion, the privileged analyses of the scientific community of experts in epidemics, experts in immunology, and so forth? How do you balance that out? So that's a question we'll address later in the Q&A, I think. So the federal authority over vaccinations per se. So there are three of the enumerated powers that are critical here: the regulation of interstate commerce clause, the spending clause, and the necessary and proper clause. Those have been the go-to clauses in Article 1 that truly allow the federal government to have some level of say, some level of major impact in public health policies, for sure, in the history of this country. One thing I can say for sure is that there are limits to the federal government mandating, requiring vaccines on the general population. So again, I said, these are all basically done at the state level. The federal government has made a point of not pushing too far with that at all, recognizing there's going to be pushback against, but also this generally covered pretty well by what the states are doing, generally speaking. So one thing I can say is that where elements in American society, in American life, where there's most definite federal control, like immigration, the military, federal workers, the Congress and the president have a ton more authority to mandate, require vaccinations, generally speaking, with exceptions that they have to allow exemptions, et cetera. But in terms of immigration, people trying to immigrate here and get the green card, people serve and work in the military, other federal workers, the federal government does have the legitimate authority to force people, to require them to get vaccines. So that does raise the question, for sure, which is really intriguing here with President Biden's efforts about his invoking executive branch authority to require federal workers to get vaccinated. That's clearly okay in terms of the Constitution. There have to be exemptions allowed. I will discuss that in a minute. But the question that arises then is, like, does he have the authority to require larger companies that employ 100 or more people? Does he have the authority to regulate their behavior? Now, to be clear, what Biden laid out, and you see this constantly mischaracterized in the media, it's wild to watch it, but Biden's executive order is basically, it's encouraging vaccinations, but it's requiring weekly testing. It's encouraging vaccinations and requiring weekly testing. It's not requiring vaccinations at all. I think he'd like to get there if he could, but he knows that would be troublesome inside the courts due to this is a state issue, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the main point here is that this notion is that, you know, where does he get the authority? They're private companies. They're not federal workers. They don't have a federal contract. How does he have the authority to do this? There are a couple laws there you can look at, but again, I mean, before I get to that, before I finish that point, just again to be clear here, Biden's executive order is requiring weekly testing, and you can opt out of the weekly testing if you get vaccinated. So he's highly encouraging, but he's not requiring vaccines for workers and companies. He's greatly encouraging. He's doing the same thing with the military and federal workers. He's requiring them, but that's a whole other story. Okay. So what I was saying here then is, like, there are generally two laws that Biden's lawyers will look to as the basis for his authority to enact to implement required vaccines. So you've got the Public Health Service Act, as well as the OSHA Act from years ago. And so the challenge here, when presidents engage in that type of unilateral executive authority, particularly here with required vaccines, because the Public Health Service Act says that basically the Secretary of Health Human Services, and they can delegate this authority to the CDC to do this, that they can take, but the law says, other measures. They can take some level of actions to stop the transmission of an infectious disease from going across state borders or coming in from a foreign country to these shores. So it's unclear whether or not that law really allows that type of action. The law says it allows the president, Secretary of Health and Human Services, i.e. the president, to be able to engage in other measures to stop the transmission of infectious disease. But does that necessarily imply, when Congress wrote that up, did they envision the president having the authority to require vaccines? That's a question. Exact same thing and so he could have utilized that. He didn't. He did utilize OSHA, the OSHA Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And so that law says basically the Secretary of Labor, i.e. the president, can issue emergency orders so as to prevent what they call in the law a grave danger from threatening the lives and the health of people working in private workplaces. That's debatable as well. I mean, that's an open-ended law. Is that what Congress envisioned? Is that, and this is getting into the weeds here of like administrative law, but I'll mention it here briefly here. This idea of what's called the delegation doctrine. This notion is that is that Congress necessarily has to allow government to work. It necessarily has to give some level of leeway discretion to executive branch officials to be able to deal with crises and emerging issues. So they kind of write laws in like a general fashion, a general manner. And so, okay, so it gets at this kind of consideration is like, if the law is too vague, and is the executive branch going too far? Are they unconstitutionally making the law themselves as opposed to simply executing the law that Congress has passed? And that's definitely the issues here when you see President Biden moving forward with these types of executive orders. That's going to be the big legal question. The laws he's predicating that authority on, are they violating the delegation doctrine? Is the executive branch making up the law as opposed to executing the law? Did Congress envision this type of pretty aggressive federal power? Do they really envision the president being able to do this or not? So that's definitely going to be out there in the courts. So the last thing, I'll wrap this up here because my time has come up here. We talk about the exemptions in the Q&A for sure. With the Roberts Court, you've got the 3 Trump appointees on there. So it's a 6-3 solid conservative majority. Roberts, he's not buying everything the other conservatives are pushing of late. So they very well, but so when in doubt, that you can say it won't be 6-3. There may be a ton of 5-4 still rightward leaning directions here in these cases, particularly here, abortion, number of things. It seems to me you're going to see a major conservative revolution in Supreme Court jurisprudence this next year with abortion, federal power, voting rights. A lot of that's going on there for sure. But again, in terms of here, my last comment with this is this idea you definitely can see in particularly, the federal courts rebuking what Governor Newsom did with his executive order reining in services for churches. The court pointedly, rebuked them and said you can't be doing that. You cannot target religions in an effort to rein in the virus. You have to treat them. You have to treat a church just as you would treat a liquor store, a gym, what have you. So I'll stop there. My time's up, and so I'll turn over to the host here.
All right, thank you, Dr. Routh, and we have some questions for you. I think I wanted to start with, and hey, Ryan, if you can make me a co-panelist for a second. So I just want to start by sharing with everyone this statement. We have it on the Civic Engagement Project site. And the statement is that, and this refers to science lectures on vaccines at MJC by Aaron Lucas and Liz McInnes and Deborah Martin, that those lectures are based on a science expert community with a specialization in vaccinology or immunology. But not just that, also folks who are actively publishing and reviewing the latest peer-reviewed data and publications in those fields. I just want to start with that. We're going to go to Q&A in a minute. But there are questions about the facts of vaccines, right? The factual, are herd immunity, are vaccines, overall dangerous or not? All those kinds of questions. Those are science questions. This talk is about the powers of the Constitution and how they relate to the federal government, state, local, Stanislaus County health officials, et cetera. That's what this talk is about. There are different talks at MJC about the science of vaccines. We have links to those talks. But it's a good question about how you mentioned this. I thought we could just start with this. How does the federal government reconcile expertise? So my understanding is that there's consensus in the field on COVID and the vaccines among vaccinologists and immunologists who have an active publishing and peer review practice. Like those folks, there's consensus. So Is that, so when we talk about the CDC and we talk about the FDA and we talk about OSHA, they're basing what they do. So they're basing what they do, right, on scientists in the field. So does the federal government like walk around and say, well, we're going to decide what a consensus is among the scientists? Like, how does that work? And how much is that enumerated in the delegation of authority, right? In the delegation doctrine, for example, I would imagine as part of that. Could you speak to that issue a little bit?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that you've got like the FDA. There are extensive rules and procedures they follow to determine, if does a vaccine do what it's supposed to do, and to maximize the safety. No vaccine is 100% effective. No vaccine has ever been 100% safe. So they basically, the FDA, the federal government, they go through extensive trials to determine whether or not, it's multi-phased to basically assess that. But that's the question though, is like, and this is the big question, with the president's authority to require a vaccine, the delegation doctrine is like that. I think the idea then is that that's really up to the states to make that call whether or not to require a vaccine, because is that really a federal responsibility to make that call? There is no specific public health authority directly mentioned in any part of the enumerated powers in Article 1. So that's why historically it's always been this idea that it's really a state issue, but states draw upon those federal insights. States don't have the funding, they don't have the resources to have a CDC or the FDA in place. So the federal government becomes an incredibly important aspect, incredibly important repository source of insight in scientific data. But the pushback against that, you definitely can see people, the vaccine skeptics, they believe a bunch of the science has basically been suppressed. There are a lot more deaths from the vaccine that have been hidden from view. And so there is inevitably a pushback by some elements of society saying they don't trust the scientists. But it's always been there in American life. I mean, but ultimately then, you've got trained professionals making these determinations. But again, the pushback against that is conflict of interest. Robert Kennedy Jr. just came out with a book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I will read it soon. But the review of it, I mean, Robert Kennedy Jr. He's a vaccine skeptic on steroids. He basically, is trying to undermine the reputation of Anthony Fauci by saying he's in bed with big pharma. All of this is just making money. There's no, you don't really need these vaccines. They're dangerous, but there's money to be made there. So, I mean, but idea though, if that's accurate, then if that's true, then you've got to have congressional committee investigations, congressional committee hearings, and just get it fleshed out. Then I think if there really was that level of impropriety of corruption going on with the CDC and FDA, the New York Times would be running headlines, or the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal, or Breitbart or something. I mean, that'd be major news, and it just isn't there. So, does that answer the question at all? Probably
yeah,
not.
it's not a process that every American will necessarily easily understand and necessarily agree with, but it's reliable enough that it works, something like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the idea then, to understand.
And then I want to pivot over to some questions from our audience.
Yeah, I'll say it very, very quick. I mean, the recognition here is like, these are highly complex topics. You need bona fide years, expertise, and training, and professional knowledge to understand them. And so this is the problem, that necessarily has to be privileged in American political discourse, but that kind of goes against the grain of American democracy. It's like, well, we don't, we have to trust.
Yeah, privilege, like the idea of, is my opinion, and then there's privileged opinion.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to, how the mRNA vaccine works,
mm-hmm.
in terms of like phospholipids being introduced into a cell. I mean, I can understand some of that, but my opinion versus privileged opinion, and that I think for many people, that's maybe a little hard to swallow, that that the government delegates powers to public health entities or to legislation like the OSHA legislation where they then incorporate their experts who have privileged opinion.
Mhm.
But I want to,
Yep.
does that sound, all right, so there's a question here by Angel. Understanding the Jacobson case and the mortality rate of 30%, requiring adults to get vaccinated seems reasonable, right? So back with smallpox, where the mortality rate is 30%, yeah, like that seems pretty clear. The government is attempting to mandate vaccinations of children as young as 5 years old when there's mortality rate of a fraction of 1%. How can that be considered reasonable? So he's asking this question about reasonability, which seems vague, clear with smallpox, but it's true. The mortality rates are far, far less with COVID. So how is that reasonable? I think that's his question.
That's a great question. I mean, where's the threshold? Who makes the call on at what point the mortality rate or the the potential injuries suffered from the illness? Who makes the determination that this requires a vaccine? That is a spot on question. That is the big question. And so, but that's why, as I said earlier, that's why judges, when they hear these cases, they prefer the legislature to make the determination. That's why Biden's executive order here with the private companies that are larger and federal workers, et cetera, is that when it gets to the courts, and they're going to look at what does OSHA say? Does it really give this authority directly? It doesn't. It's pretty vague. It doesn't really give them that authority. It kind of doesn't. It's vague and open-ended. The Public Health Services Act, exact same thing. Then, I mean, they'd want to say, damn it, if you want to have a federal vaccine requirement, it's got to come to U.S. Congress. Congress has got to make the call, not the president, because it's a democracy, damn it, and the people's branch should be the one making the call. So
another question here. Oh, and by the way, the issue is there's mortality, but there's also issues of long-term illness, use of medical resources, right? There's not just the issue.
Yes, no, exactly.
It isn't just mortality per se, but all the other issues too. So another question is, this is from an anonymous attendee. Obviously, SCOTUS can overturn precedents, and the current justices have not followed them. If the case is granted cert, do you think they would overturn the vaccine precedent? So could you do some crystal ball gazing with the current court on this issue? If there's a test case, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's also a great question as well. I mean, yeah, it is definitely a crystal ball question, but it seems like, I don't know, I mean, precedents, Jacobson, the reason in Jacobson, the reason in Zucht, the reason in Prince, they make a lot of sense. So it seems, other issues confronting the courts. I mean, you look at like abortion. It looks like pretty sure this coming year that you're no longer going to see that as protected by the U.S. Constitution, or it's going to be rolled back to a great degree. Roe may not be directly overturned, but it's going to be rolled back. It seems to me looking at the current court for sure. But in terms of Jacobson and so forth, that's a hard one to say, because clearly you look at the common welfare, the public health, like, how do you make that call? How do you second guess the government, the experts in the government? What should the U.S. Supreme Court should not be second guessing the assessments of experts? Is the idea then when something like this, it's a complex scientific issue. Should they make that call? So, but they definitely rebuked Newsom a couple, but those are, those could have gone either way, really. But Newsom's executive order was kind of reining in. You can't hold church services because they're super spreader events. That's different. That's different than stopping disease from being transmitted directly by vaccination. Clearly, scientific experts will tell you the best way to rein in a virus is vaccination. Preventing people from grouping together, that can help, but ultimately the way to stop it for sure is vaccination. So that's a great question. I don't know.
Related question on that. It seems like the law and mandates revolve on public health. COVID has over a 90% recovery rate. Now we're getting into factual claims about the vaccine, so I'm always wanting to know What's the source for that? Does it come from the peer review vaccinology, immunology community? But let's assume it's something like that, a high recovery rate, including long-term COVID. With a stat like that, how is public health an issue? And my question, I want to add on to that, does the state governments or through the delegation doctrine, do they do a kind of like risk assessment with this? Sort of, for example, smallpox, the chances of dying of the smallpox vaccine in the literature you sent me, I think it was like 1 out of 50. Like 1 or 2% of people who got the got the smallpox vaccine back in 1905 died. So 1 out of 50, where today with, I think it's Guillain-Barré, you can be hospitalized at a chance of 1 in 120,000. So like, right? And then the chances of dying of COVID, if you get it, like 1 in 61, but the chances of smallpox was like, 1 out of 3. So it's like you're weighing risks, right? You're weighing the risks. And so does the federal government, does that become part of the judicial reasoning, weighing of risks of these things when they're allowing the states to do what they want? The deference principle. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that the courts definitely, they don't want to engage in that type of balancing. Now, the Roberts Court may engage in that. They may say this has been overreach. A paternalistic federal government has got to be reined in. You got to stop this. But they may not. I mean, but this is why it comes down to this question about, who does the math, who does the calculations, who makes the determination about at what point is this disease so overly problematic you have to require people to be vaccinated against it. And as you said earlier, this great point about, and it's a very important point about ICUs being overwhelmed, people getting COVID, and then other people not getting cancer surgeries, brain surgeries they need because there's just no room in hospitals. So there is, you pull in that thread and it really starts to unravel. But again, the idea then the courts are going to like, that's really not our job here. Is this constitutional or not? And that's the question: is this legal or not? To these rules, and again, the upshot here is that basically the courts are going to say this is a legislative decision. This is the elected official, let the governor and the legislators or the president make this call, and let the voters decide on it afterwards, whether they want to have those people in power.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Edward. So you mentioned the Supreme Court might weigh in on state vaccine mandates. What would they use to say the states could not institute vaccine mandates? Like, right? So how would the Supreme Court weigh in and like say, no, we're going to stop you. You're doing this thing, we're going to stop you. What would they use to do that? Yeah,
they would have to take a look at the data themselves and say, is this reasonable? Looking at the scientific, studies and the conclusions drawn, is it reasonable? Is it a reasonable response to this disease?
Okay.
And so that's basically it. But I mean, but that's why they don't have that expertise. And so that's why they're ultimately the deferential, because once you start, I've been reading a lot over the last several months on this stuff. And as you alluded to earlier, Bill, like you start reading the scientific literature, the studies on vaccines, like you're reading Greek. I mean, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. It's complicated.
I want to go to another question. And just, I'm aware of the National Academy of Sciences. In my head, that's like at the federal level, and the Supreme Court or the federal government has access to the National Academy of Sciences in a way that maybe everybody does, but I'm going to move on. That's a question I have maybe later. I have another question here. This came up at MJC's town hall meetings with our president. What are the requirements for religious exemptions? Like, for example, an issue that we're wondering about, I think, is our HR department. If we have an immunization requirement, what would allow someone to have a religious exemption? Can you tell us that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, basically, it's a long story, but I won't go into the long story. Mm-hmm. But basically, at the state level, there's no constitutional reason why you have to offer a religious exemption from the U.S. Constitution. There's no direct reason coming from the U.S. Constitution to allow that. I would say. I mean, and stemming from the fact that like it's basically it's called the Smith standard. I'm not going to get into the case, but the Smith standard basically states that when states implement, when they enact a law that is neutral toward religion, it's not targeting religion, it's not trying to punish religion, but it's religiously neutral. It's not intended to hurt a particular faith, and it's of general broad applicability. There's no need for an exemption to that law. So, in that decision was written up by Justice Scalia, conservative. This idea then, that just because you're religious doesn't allow you an exemption from an otherwise generally applicable law, because that's the question, that arises then of like, if you allow too many religious exemptions, then you're not going to get herd immunity. You're not going to end the virus. It's going to continue getting percolating out there, and it won't go away. But in response directly to a workplace scenario there, you do have so again, to be clear, there's no real constitutional reason to be able to grant an exemption due to the Smith standard. However, you also have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would require a religious exemption. So it's not the Constitution that's going to require religious exemption. It's much more federal law, Civil Rights Act of 64. You cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of their religion, which means you have to give them a religious exemption, provided you have to give them a reasonable accommodation, provided that reasonable accommodation is not causing an undue hardship on the employer. So.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, this is from Bonnie Hunt, who
I know Bonnie. It's the Bonnie Hunt I know.
Yes, and runs our respiratory care program. So here's a question. Thank you, Dr. Routh, for your presentation. You mentioned Zoot. Is it how you say it? Zoot versus King?
Z-U-C-H-T, Zoot.
Zoot versus King, where the court ruled that the U.S. Constitution does not prevent states from acquiring vaccines for school children.
Yes.
Therefore, if we require MMR, M as in Mary, Robert, MMR, and other vaccines for children to enroll and attend school for essentially public health, like we require those, what prevents states from mandating vaccines? Is not the mandate based upon state legislative decision who represents the people? And this seems also similar to the, at MJC, we're required to do tetanus, I think tetanus shots or tetanus tests. And so that's required. Yeah, so if we're requiring MMR, isn't that already a precedent for other kinds of vaccines?
It is. It is exactly. And I think that's probably why you're probably not going to see the Roberts Court, roll back these types of precedents, because then you have all of these vaccines that have been in place for all these years, and it's basically been accepted. That the scientific data is in that measles and mumps and diphtheria are highly dangerous. And so, yeah, I think that's just it. I mean, that it's been in place. How do you, but again, the question that arises then of like, is in the great political science insight about non-events. You have vaccinations work. They eradicate diseases. Then people they say, well, there's nothing to worry about anymore, and they don't get those vaccinations, and basically those diseases come back. So I think that's one thing. I think the Roberts Court will look long and hard at the history of these tendencies, and how that you leave it up to the expertise of the health professionals who know epidemiology, who know the history of these diseases, and they're just going to come back if you don't allow these required vaccines to be in place. So.
And thank you. And I want to remind everyone that we're focused on questions around, how does that Constitution delegate authority to states, and then how does that then filter down to county, for example, Department of Public Health officials. So, we also don't really have time, and this talk is not about how people's beliefs are formed. And that's another issue that we're not so much focused on right here, but it does seem that we seem to be relatively more okay with accepting the state mandating vaccinations, with infants, I think. But this is different in a way because we're adults that are now, maybe being told we have to get a vaccine. So anyway, I'm not sure if there's a historical precedent. Well, there was with smallpox. Okay, next question here. This is from Joshua Bruce. Considering bans on mask mandates for local school districts have been struck down under the parameters of the ADA, Adults with American Disability Act.
Yep.
Could the president lean on the ADA to promote an environment that accommodates for the safety of our Americans with disabilities while pushing for vaccine mandates for federal employees and contractors? And I could repeat that again. Considering bans on mask mandates for local school districts have been struck down under the parameters of the ADA. I guess, like, considering that mask mandates have been struck down using the ADA to do that, could the president lean on the ADA to promote an environment that accommodates for the safety of Americans with disabilities while pushing for vaccine mandates for federal employees? Is that the case, that there have been bans on mask mandates using the ADA?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that at all. I've not heard of that. Now,
so maybe Joshua, I'm not sure if I stated your question correctly. Maybe you could come back and repost that. I want to move on to.
Well, I would just say that if someone has the ADA is very clear. You have to have exemptions for disability people on, with masking and vaccinations, of course, but you then give them an exemption. You don't throw out the entire mask mandate. You give particular people exemptions for that, who have breathing issues and what have you,
on a case by case basis using the ADA.
Yeah.
So the question is, can the president lean on the ADA or use the ADA to promote an environment that accommodates for safety while pushing? Yeah, so I think that's the question, is if there's vaccine mandates or requirements for immunization, how are those with disabilities where they can't have a mask, but that's they can't be vaccinated? I mean, that's another issue. What about those who can't be vaccinated because of health issues? They're allergic to the vaccine or they're immunocompromised. How does that work in an employment situation?
Well, yeah, you have to have a reasonable accommodation of them. You have to, give them a private workplace. They're tested frequently. There are ways around that, but again, that's going to come down to the individual circumstance. Is that an undue hardship on the employer? I mean, if someone has a job as like a toll taker on like the Bay Bridge, and that's just, they have to deal with people, and they have to be right there with people. Yet their disability with COVID is a problem with that. That's just a function of how can you accommodate that reasonably without causing an undue burden. So I have to punt on this and basically saying it all depends on the individual circumstances and the employment lawyers hashing it out.
Next question by Ronald Haney. My employer told me that they are not required to enforce vaccination because they are a private company instead of a corporation or public company. Is this true? So, yeah, could you comment on that?
Well, the caveat is that I'm not a lawyer. Okay, I'm a common law professor, so I definitely seek out a credentialed lawyer to make that call. But it seemed like my reviewing of Biden's executive order, companies over 100 or more people, public, I didn't strike me as that matter whether it's purely private or it's open. It's a public company in the sense of selling stocks in it. So I'd ask a lawyer about that directly. I don't want to get it wrong. So because I don't know enough about it.
And then let's say that it does apply to private companies with over 100 employees. I mean, does that mean that
well, it does. I'm not sure what the difference is between a private and a public company. I mean, private companies are open up to the public to purchase things where they're. I'm not sure what's meant by a public company per se. So, I mean, obviously, I almost said Trump. Biden's executive order was directed towards private companies. who are large enough to rein in the spread of the virus.
Although I think we're understanding that to apply to us as well at MJC. That came up. I think that issue came up in a town hall.
Yeah.
Next question by Crystal Guerrero. I understand that Biden is not forcing anyone to get the vaccine. But is there a way that he could get in trouble for requiring people to get weekly tested? Although not explicit, and it's just a way to encourage people. Okay. So would it still hold against the Constitution, since some may claim it's essentially putting people in a hard place to enforce weekly testing? So this is another issue that's come up in our discussions about, is it mandate vaccine or mandate weekly testing?
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on that in terms of Constitution, federal law, state law?
Yeah. I mean, when you're mandating testing, you're incurring a cost. That's going to cost a company to do it, and cost someone's time from work to do it as well. So there's a cost incurred. If it goes to a court for review, the court is going to balance out. Okay, you have the public health concern on one hand, and this inconvenience or this cost to the company on the other, and that judge or the panel of judges, if it's an appellate court, will have to engage in a balancing test. Saying, okay, on one hand we have this, and the other hand you have that, and so I don't mean to be a waffling scholar here, but it just depends on who that judge is. But in terms of past jurisprudence, again, the general idea is that judges are going to defer to the government officials, their determination of what's the best way to maintain public health. So,
and here at MDC, I believe that a test is $70. If we're testing 1,000 students a week,
I think it's very expensive. Yeah.
It suddenly becomes, $3, $4, $5 million, $30 million. I mean, we just can't.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a budget for that. Are mandates or requirements allowed that can't be paid for?
Yeah, again, that would definitely be the assessment of the judge about what state law allows for. Can they impose a cost or not? I mean, so that's definitely a great suit right there. Like a lawsuit indeed. It can go either way. But
okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
So here's a question by Ashley, and it's a question that comes up a lot. And this goes to individual rights, individual freedoms versus government imposition. What if a person understands the risk of not getting the vaccine, right? So let's say somebody accepts all the vaccine science from the peer review, top experts, immunology, vaccinology. They understand their chances of getting hospitalized by the vaccine is 1 in 120,000. And they understand all that, and they say, I still don't want to get vaccinated. It's just an imposition. You are putting something into my body. I don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
How can the federal government, force someone to have something injected into their arm, when they clearly understand? Let's say they understand, like, I'm probably going to be fine. It'll probably protect me. I totally get it. I just don't like the idea of you putting this thing in my arm. How can the federal government do that? Well, kind of gone through it a bit, but I just want the sweet, sharp, like, what gives them the power to do that to me, even if I understand all the science around it and I accept, I'm just taking my own responsibility. It's my choice.
So an important way to think about it is this notion is that it's not necessarily protecting you, it's protecting the community. It's for the public good. I mean, it's like CDC has said if everyone got the vaccination when it came out immediately, if everyone got it, there are no more human hosts for COVID to mutate into Delta, which is a much more problematic variant according to the science, if you believe the science. I do. I don't know why I wouldn't believe it. But so the notion then is like it's for the common good. It's the public welfare. It's similar. You're not getting it would be fine. It'd be complete. It'd just be an individual liberty just for you. If your decision only affected you, but it doesn't just affect you. It affects potentially many other people in a potentially lethal manner. And so
so if I say, look, I know that if I'm not vaccinated, I'm putting others at risk. And that's, yeah, I'll be as careful as I can. You know, I'll wear a mask. I'll do what I can. But I don't want you putting this thing in my body, knowing that it puts others at risk. The response is just, well, sorry, is it common good? I mean, is it that simple? Is it just like?
I think it is that simple, but I think the analogies are like, you know, the ability of the government to rein in cigarette smoking in public places. You know, cigarette smoking obviously correlates heavily with getting lung cancer. Not always, but it does. So for many people. So the notion is, but they ban cigarette smoking because the secondhand smoke, it's affecting other people problematically. You know, and so. But
that's different because no one's forcing the, you know, no one's forcing like a cigarette vaccine into my body, like, right? Someone's just telling me what I can't do. I can't smoke. No one's saying, I think, you know, no one's like putting this thing in my body, right? Like saying you have to put this thing in my body.
Yeah.
Okay, next question here. Not sure about, let's see, the natural immunity position is being overlooked in mandates. Studies have shown the protection is. So there's a question around natural immunity and herd immunity. And that question goes back to this issue of, you know, who do we trust to interpret, right, the legitimate experts on vaccine science who are immunologists, vaccinologists, who have that active peer review publishing practice. But what if somebody on their own like finds an outlier in that group, right? And who says, hey, you know, natural immunity or herd immunity, like we don't need this because of herd immunity. Again, that goes back to just the courts figure that out, I guess. They decide at the end of the day that they're going to trust the National Academy of Sciences. I mean, is that?
Well, yeah, but let me just jump on the one point you're talking about, herd immunity. Herd immunity can work basically where people who are susceptible to it, who die from it, they're no longer hosts because they die from it. Herd immunity is reinforced by vaccinations. But more and more people are vaccinated, that's more herd immunity. But if you didn't have any vaccinations at all, and you just go with the herd immunity way to do it, you're going to have a ton of people die because they're going to die from the disease because they're susceptible to it. So that's one way to get to herd immunity, but that's kind of violating the idea of public health, that they're allowing the strong to survive, but you know that's kind of saying that on public health.
You're saying that your understanding of the science is that if we go for herd immunity, it's you kind of are jettisoning public health.
Well, yeah, the whole idea behind natural herd immunity, if you have the whole point of vaccinations is to get to herd immunity much more quickly. When you have 90% people vaccinated, then there's no place for the virus to go. It's not going to survive anymore. Generally speaking, depends on the actual disease.
All right, there's a question now about California, and I do want to make this clear. You have the federal government using deference to the states. So, and then the state of California, there's something called Cal-OSHA, but then there's also the CDC at the federal level. But the state of California, and then we have that, and then we also have the Stanislaus Department of Public Health. And so entities in Stanislaus County, are they why are they following, like, how does the head of public health in Stanislaus County have this kind of power? How does that relate? Does that come from the state? I think, does the state give them that power, or does that go straight to the federal government? And if you can put that here, the question here, is there anything specific in the California Constitution that would help a vaccine mandate for children? Is anything would hurt? Yeah, so could you just comment on this issue of California state power and its relationship to county power with this stuff?
Yeah, well, my caveat with all this is that I'm trained in the U.S. Constitution and the federal government. The state stuff, I'm not that well versed in it all. So in terms of a California constitutional question, it's a great question because there's a lot of these debates, a lot of these fights end up, what does state law say? What does state constitution say? Like Governor Abbott in Texas, Governor DeSantis in Florida, Governor Newsom here. But it's complicated in California because you look at it, it does get very confusing about when you look at how decentralized is the public health system? I mean, because clearly different counties, when we're under the tier system, different counties were directed to issue certain orders coming from the state when you're in a certain tier or not. And so, but as a tier system has fallen away, it seems much more inherently decentralized now. That before, Sacramento was kind of calling the shots with the tiers, what's acceptable, what's not. So that's changed, but I cannot pretend to be an expert on the California Constitution, California law with this or California structures. I'm not that versed in that, so I can't.
All right, we have one more minute, so I'm going to ask you one more question here. And this is from a anonymous attendee. Can MJC require you to be vaccinated in order to return to the campus when it reopens full time? If that ever happens, is there a law? So, it says MJC. So could we talk about that? That's our big debate. Can MJC make that requirement in the spring that we all be vaccinated when we come back onto campus?
In terms of the U.S. Constitution, yes. And in terms of the California Constitution, I don't know precisely, but I would assume yes. But in terms of the U.S. Constitution, again, a state, entities subordinate to the state are Dillon's rule, are appendages of the state. So yeah, basically, states are allowed to mandate vaccines. I would say in terms of U.S. Constitution, I'd say yes, indeed. So, but that's what's interesting here. I mean, my last comment on this is that CSU Stanislaus, we're requiring vaccinations, but we allow medical and religious exemptions. I was at several Zoom meetings over the months here, and it came out that, basically CSU legal counsel believed they would lose in court if someone pushed for, if CSU did not allow religious exemption and someone sued, they would probably lose. Other units of the California state government, their lawyers said no, they wouldn't lose. So other entities don't have a religious exemption. Like University of California does not allow a religious exemption at all for like the MMR vaccination. So I don't know where CSU legal counsel is coming from, because my study of the common law, with the Smith standard, the Sherbert standard, all these standards, all these cases, it seemed clear to me that they would probably win, but they did not want to risk it. But it's not just legal; it's also the optics, the politics of things. How's it going to play with public opinion, et cetera. So there are constitutional questions that we've been focusing on. But there are inherently political dimensions, political calculations behind these things as well. So that's all.
Okay. I think we could go on for another hour or two. And
days. We can go on for days about this.
Part of it is because it's quite complicated.
Yeah, it is.
Right? It's just a complicated process. So I want to thank you for presenting on constitutionality, compulsory vaccines, and I want to thank all of our participants and the CEP staff and faculty who have helped make this possible. And I want to apologize that we couldn't get through every single question. We couldn't answer all of the questions. We did focus on the Constitution questions. Thank you very much. And I wish everybody an excellent weekend. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I've enjoyed it.
Okay.
Take care, everyone. Bye.